Hello everybody, welcome. So, it's been a while since I've made a recording orbiting the phenomenon of Ammon HIllman. Now, if you're trying to think of Ammon as a pure scholar, you're missing most of what's going on there. And I think that nearly all of the people who are evaluating Ammon are evaluating him wrong. In other words, they're applying the wrong principles. This is like trying to figure out what a bird is by applying a knife to a dead bird that you killed. Right? And the goal here really is to destroy or defame or object to the messages that Ammon is presenting us with. And generally, most of what has gone on is straw manning, change of venue arguments, where they won't allow Ammon to play in the venue that he produces naturally from his passionate and feral scholarship. And by feral, I mean outside the rules and laws and lies, the trenchant ontological gatekeeping of the academy. You need to understand about HIllman that many of these quests began because he was a Christian. And not just a Christian, he was a preacher. Right? He was an evangelist for certain branches of Christianity. And so he lived in a mental structure, a psycho-spiritual ontology that he later discovered was false. And the key to this discovery for him was clearly reading Aristotle. Right? This messed him up. Messed him up so badly that in this process of being enlightened by reading Aristotle, we must probably imagine in the original Greek. Love to know how many of you have pulled that off. He immediately went out, and if I understand the story correctly, he had a transaction with a woman of the night, so to speak, and had sex probably for the first time in his life, presuming that he was not abused, which is something we don't know the answer to, right? And this introduced him to an entire universe outside the prison systems that he had grown up under the domination of, ontologically, spiritually, psychologically, epistemologically, phenomenologically, right? All these aspects had been shuttered, gate-kept, lied about, and reinforced constantly. And one of the primary features of this reinforcement is that community outside of the universities, right, the museum, community is mediated by false gods. They don't have to be religious gods. They can be gods of ideology, gods of the market, authoritarian ontologies, ontological fascism, right? This kind of thing. And he had been deep within that and discovered the same thing in the academy, right? He wrote his dissertation and was told it would not be published, he would not receive his PhD unless he submitted to their displacements, lying, and eviction of something, a broad array of features of ancient Roman society, Greek society, that were obviously everywhere prevalent, yet we are not allowed to discuss, explore, opine on, reveal, right? All of this shit, right? So he did his work as an academic and got slapped down for coloring outside the accepted lines. You need to understand this. You need to take this very seriously. Now, Ammon HIllman is not merely a scholar, and he is not an ordinary human by any stretch of the imagination. This is a man who has been outside the cave, illuminated to us by the, in Ammon's view, the extremely skillful liar, Plato. But Plato's lies can be illuminative even though they're false, right? And this is the other thing. Not all lying is deceptive, right? It is possible to have ideas that are provably wrong and at the same time more profound than any proof or assertion you can possibly table. The arbiter of value in thought, intellect, perspective, analogy, metaphor. Metaphors are not true, but they are vastly more fraught with revelation than any description will ever be, especially when they're powerful and have not yet been converted into the kind of tokenized tropes, right? Like, whoever dies with the most toys wins. What an absurdly ironic nonsense thing that should be understood as ironic and paradoxical from the get-go, except that our societies are forged around a myth just like this. Right? So I don't think Ammon is concerned with proof. What Ammon is concerned with, rather than the consensus of academics, which he does not give a shit about, or the consensus of religious scholars, doesn't care, for really important reasons. If you want insight, you're going to have to go beyond and outside the structured, sort of the metastatic, viralized structure of the stories and narratives that have captured systems that dominate people and minds. Yeah. When Ammon speaks of situations in which people of different ages are being treated abusively, there is a direct link to the treatment he has received as a scholar and academic when he attempted to play that game by the basic rules that are given. And every scholar and every academic and many scientists, right now Avi Loeb is a great example of such a scientist, are repudiated and punished, rejected and reviled if they even suggest that something beyond what we've been told is probably the case. It must be the case, because what we've been told, you're talking a reasonable grasp on less than 1% of any phenomenon we can bring into question. So the idea that the prevailing concepts, categories, ideas, suppositions, narratives, histories, right? The sense that those could possibly be true or veritable or even credible is largely misguided where it is not useful and demonstrably enlightening. Yep. So Ammon, I don't know him personally. We've had one conversation. I hope to have another. I'm looking forward to that. But Ammon is not and should not be seen as a scholar and should not be treated in this way. I've been listening to Danny Jones' discussion between Danny, some classicist who seems to have good credentials, whose name I have not tracked. Right? Frankly, I consider that name kind of unworthy of tracking, but I should know it. Problem is, in the way that I'm watching the video, the name is not displayed. So they're having a discussion, and I recall the completely fucking ridiculous nonsense that ensued when Danny got some guy who claimed to be a Christian exorcist or something to talk with Ammon, and instead of taking Ammon seriously or debating with him or exploring ideas with him or exploring Ammon's findings, right, how he sees, what Ammon sees, none of that got explored. It was an absolute change of venue, and the guy treated Ammon and claimed that he was possessed by a demon. Huh? Well, if I disagree with someone, the easiest way to get rid of them is just to try to convince everybody that this isn't a regular human, this is a little demon car. Right? There's a demon in there, or maybe more, maybe lots of demons. They're just having a party inside this guy. Right? This is a great way to completely dismiss honest exploration together with the goal of seeing better. Right? Not trying to determine what is the truth. You're never going to get at the truth of things that have infinite variables and things that we can only get a grasp on a small portion of that space. Right? You're definitely not going to find out what's true. And what is probable is also not a reasonable guide. Right? What you need, I think what Ammon would say, is you need to attend very closely the original sources and understand to the best that it is possible, like in an increasingly insightful way, what is what the comparative evaluation of original sources and texts, how those experiences inform our vision of the situation in the ancient world, in the places where we are specifically exploring, right? These are places that include vast portions of Europe and the Middle East, and are connected by trade routes to other places as well. So I think the scholar, classicist who Danny has invited in, I certainly acknowledge what I understand to be his academic background. Yeah, definitely. He has a very complex array of skills and educational paths, linguistics, semantics, Akkadian, some Sumerian, some Sanskrit, Hebrew, Greek. This guy's got a lot going on. But he does not have a position at all, right? What he has is something like the intentional suspension of a position. And so Ammon does have positions, though he will call them something else. And when Ammon says things like, "This is why I hate ideas," what he's saying is, show me the structured relationships between available texts that promote or support or lead you to the views you are propounding. Yeah? And the reason Ammon is doing this is that he's not merely unusually well read in ancient Greek. Every person that studies an ancient language myself included, unless, this is probably uncommon, but there's reasons that drove them to this pursuit. There are purposes and motivations, right? And not just in this for the game of it. And the guy that is talking to Ammon on Danny's recent podcast, which I will link in the description, is a champion of consensus, probabilistic interpretation of texts. This is not Ammon's game by a long shot. Ammon has no interest in that, as far as I can tell. He doesn't give a shit what the consensus is, for good reason. Ammon is questing to try to bring to life, in his mind, heart, thought, and being, the ways of the ancient Greeks, their language, their science, their philosophy, their medicine, their polypharmacy, their sexuality, their perspective on nature, creation, and the gods. He wants to know this firsthand. These other people are clinical, they're observing from little positions in the bleachers and making artful clinical derivations, right? That's not Ammon. And if you don't see what Ammon's doing, there's no chance of you having a generative or fruitful discussion with him, especially if you insist that the field of play is consensus scholarship, right? It's like trying to make a bird swim underwater. It's just not gonna fly. Pun intended. Ammon is a feral mystagogue, half or more possessed by what are obviously teaching beings, illuminative beings. I mean, what do you think the dead girl is? When he talks about the dead girl, it's like talking about his mother, his wife, his daughter, his sister, his goddess, the light, the moon, the water, the shining of the moon on the water. These are evocative and invocative relationships. The spirit of the dead girl lights his heart on fire and forces him to pursue the paths that reveal what is being lied about in modernity. Right? Think of all the Western archaeology done and all the Western writing and thought done about the Native American peoples. Completely different ways of being in the world than ours, yet apparently we tell them what their behavior meant and was for. Now, this is the same kind of shit that is happening with the ancient Greek, and Ammon is the absolute enemy of that nonsense. And anybody who doesn't recognize this should not be talking to him. Right? Has no right to sit down with this man at all. Right? This is a living revivification, a resurrection of the ancient Greek ways in a present-day modern human being. He is a psychopomp. Yeah, he is a mystagogue. Now, I have great appreciation for Ammon's spirit, and parts of what his mission appear to be like to me. I don't have a clear view. I hope to ask him a lot of deep questions. But this nonsensical posing of Ammon against scholars or evangelists is ridiculous in the extreme. Really, it's like taking a piece of fruit to a car dealership to have it repaired. Yeah, it just the context is completely backwards. To understand what Ammon is doing, you have to imagine what he's reading, why he's reading it, and how deep his passion for this topic and its histories and its mysteries and the spirit beings, the souls, the intelligences, the daimons, that possessed our ancestors, right? They didn't walk around making volitional choices. They were told what to be, become, do, see, how to grow, what truth was. We have all of this entirely backwards in modernity. We think, oh, the gods were outside us and we appealed to them for things. No, no, no. The dead girl is not outside Ammon. He's not appealing to her for things. They're one being, right? And I know firsthand what this is like, and it is nothing like what moderns will imagine or think. And very few scholars will ever get anywhere near the inversion of the popular suppositions that would grant them insight into these matters. And really, the only way you're going to get insight is to have a direct experience firsthand and know what it means to be possessed, but not in the sense that the Christians mean, right? Possessed by a virtuous, trustworthy intelligence that exists outside of time. There's so much more to say about this particular thing, but I'm going to table it for later because I'm gonna have a long talk about some topics that staggering insights I've had lately around them. Primarily possession and splitting. I'll say something very simple. Our species was born to be possessed. And where we're not possessed by something veritable, compelling, and powerful, we make representations of its absences and become possessed by those. We are made, the water that our species was born in was transcendental, intentionally composed. We were probably largely intentionally composed ourselves. We are made to host other intelligences within us the way fish are made for water, and we don't know this, and we're confused as hell about it, and so our ontologies are inside out and backwards, where they are not, helpful, useful, somewhat credible. Ammon doesn't care a bit about probabilities. It's not a gambler, right? And this, little trope that the other scholar made up, pulling a Dick Nixon, is so ironic because that guy is doing the same thing by forming that trope. I could explain this technically. So a Dick Nixon is where you presume that the word dick always refers to a phallus, right? Because somewhere you found it referring to a phallus. Yeah. And what this guy is doing is the same thing in reverse. He's presuming that the fact that it somewhere refers to a phallus can be rejected because it sometimes refers to other things. Yeah. That's the same move. Yeah. Same rhetorical move, slightly inverted, counterfeited, camouflaged as, no, this is what a trustworthy scholarship looks like. Yeah. Apparently, trustworthy scholarship should always be skeptical, always be clinical, never try to find out what the feeling of the time and place was, what the subjective experience of living in these times and places was like, that we can see from within the language that comes down to us in records. Now, there's a long tirade in the Danny Jones talk that is completely absurd. I wish I'd been a fly on the wall there because I'd have torn that shit to shreds. Ammon is asking for evidence of corroborative texts in Hebrew from a certain period. He's asking a very direct question. Do you have corroborative texts? And the excuse made by the other scholar is no, we don't, because they were all burned down. right? But this ignores Ammon's concern, which is in the Greek, we have corroborative texts from all over the place, so many of them that you could not possibly read them in a lifetime. In Hebrew, we have effectively nothing. Yeah? Nothing like this. Where are the libraries? Well, the excuse is they were all burned down. Okay, maybe they were all burned down. Right? That doesn't help you because Ammon's point is still clearly, truly, obviously a fact. Right? There are no such corroborative texts. And if you say, well, there's a handful of them, okay, well, there's 40,000 of them in Greek. You got a handful in Hebrew, you don't have the corroboration you need to understand the situation. You've got nothing. The environment's empty, and it doesn't matter if you claim it was burned down, it doesn't matter if you claim angels came down and took it to heaven, or they shot it off in space to the moon. You can make any kind of claim you want. The blatant fact is there are no such texts, according to Ammon. Now, I don't know if that is actually the case, and the scholars should not change venue. When Ammon asks for evidence of corroborative texts, he changes the venue, moves the goalpost. Instead of saying, you're right, there are no vast banks of corroborative texts for Hebrew linguistic scholarship prior to the Torah, there just isn't really much at all. There might be a little bit here and there, I don't know. But if there were, then the scholar should say, yes, there are thousands of texts. They're from here and here and here. Here are 5 examples. Doesn't do this. What he gives is, when Ammon's asking him about Proto-Hebraic, which I am aware of and have studied to some degree, he has one object, which is an inscription on silver, a very brief, 10 words or something. And Ammon's asking, how do you know this is Proto-Hebraic? There's no answer. Right? Again and again, Ammon asks questions, and the response is always change of venue. Well, consensus says this. We know because this guy told us or that guy told us. Ammon's work is completely different from that, right? Ammon is an integrator of the continuum that lies over the available Greek texts, many of which nearly no one has read, and this guy has not read. He does not know Galen. If he knows much about the medical texts from ancient Greek, none of that is clear from his discussion. And Ammon is absolutely steeped in this. If you're going to bring somebody to fight with Ammon, right, which is kind of a dumb idea because Ammon is like a light. You want to use him to shine on things and see better, not sit around arguing with him. But if you're going to bring somebody to debate with Ammon, then they have to be familiar with the material that Ammon is familiar with. They need to have read Galen, Nonus, 19 other people, 50 other people, with a deep passion and an interest, not clinically. Right? Ammon is not a fucking clinician. Yeah? He doesn't give a shit about abstractions. This is why he says, I hate ideas. He's doing what Scarborough told him. Go to the primary sources and do not depart from them. You have to understand this. Now, has Ammon departed from them? We all have biases. We all have specific fields of interest. And one of Ammon's is obviously, what was magic, medicine, eros, sexuality, and wisdom in the ancient world? He wants to know firsthand. Not in some explanation or some scholarly discourse. He does not care about that. If you want to know what fruit tastes like, you bite into fruit, you chew it up, you get the flavor in you. This is what Ammon is doing. And this is why he is powerful and important, even if there's some, adolescent, playful often, puerile sometimes, right? eternal child is what I mean here. Aspects of Ammon's way of life and presentation and so forth. But he is a magician, and he is a fool in the sense meant in the Tarot, and he is experiencing, let me just be absolutely clear about this. Ammon didn't merely read the PGM. It's very clear that the dead girl is the voice that you summon in the first ritual in the PGM, the companion, the assistant. And when that voice comes to Ammon, through bibliomancy or however the 5 ways she showed up for him, Ammon did precisely what it is said you must do in the PGM. He followed the instructions. When asked what it was he most desired, he said, "Let your voice never leave me. Stay with me always." There's a lot more to explore here, but I'm going to take a break, meditate. I shall return. All right, so this is a continuation of yesterday's recording on the topic of Ammon HIllman's the mess that occurred on Danny Jones's podcast with the classicist Luke G. I can't recall his last name. I'm having a hard time wanting to remember that person. There's so much wrong here. Like, Danny should be embarrassed about what took place. I would be embarrassed if I were him. And the behavior of Luke, while pretending to be what? Clinical, academic, I don't even know. I mean, he keeps saying throughout this ridiculous interrogation that he's there to call balls and strikes. What does that even mean? Like, apparently he is the authorized arbiter of, like some kind of tyrannical parent or something, of Ammon HIllman's vision of the primary sources in the Greek texts, which is pervasive because he has read thousands of pages of related material. Right? So when Ammon says something like Christos, it means to put stuff up or on or in you. Right? This is not a joke. One of the most common translations that we hear of the name of Jesus Christ is the Anointed One. And in Christianity, this is always presumed to mean that God anointed Jesus with the Holy Spirit. Right? Okay. If we were in any kind of evidentiary court, which is what it appears Luke is attempting to very badly simulate here. Catastrophically poor simulation. The concept that Jesus was anointed by God is a matter of faith. It's not a matter of linguistics. It's not a matter of semantics. It's not a matter of which words were used. It's just straight up understood to be one thing. The Lord of all being, the creator of the universe, anointed Jesus with the Holy Spirit. This is how it is understood commonly in Christianity. Saying hello to one of my heart trees here. So this guy Luke, who's probably Dr. somebody, I imagine he has PhDs somewhere. I remember him, telling his credentials, but I don't care much about them now. Although I will acknowledge that he is extremely well educated about these general topics: linguistics, ancient languages, wine, apparently, some magical stuff, maybe, Akkadian, whatever. Right? He's got reasonable credentials. But him trying to arbitrate over Ammon HIllman, which is an unfair position to place Ammon in, or to place Luke in, right? Why is Luke above Ammon? Why is he the arbiter of truth in this inquisition? No explanation. Right? What, his credentials are better? No, they're not. In the fields that Ammon specializes in, where we must imagine Ammon has spent hundreds, if not thousands, of hours reading Nonus, Philuminus, Galen, the list of 50 to 100 other authors goes on and on. And specifically when they're discussing Ammon's common assertion that Christos, in the specific texts that Ammon is concerned with, not universally, means to apply drugs, substances, intoxicants, venoms, herbs, pieces of animals, effluent from animals, including human animals, substances produced by the bodies of human beings and animals. All these things. And Luke, for his part, does something completely ridiculous in the beginning of the interview, where he effectively says that what we're not going to allow is the proposition that some term, some word, with multiple senses shall be taken only in one of those senses. And he forges a very poorly crafted rhetorical weapon here. Very poorly, crudely crafted rhetorical weapon. He decides to call it a Dick Nixon. And his assertion, which is as absurd as it is constant in his objections, is that because a dick might refer to a phallus, we cannot always assume that is its reference, because Dick is also a nickname for people named Richard. Love to know what the relationship between Richard and Dick actually is, because I do not know how you get Dick from Richard. But that assertion is false, right? What he's done there is he's trying to preempt very skilllessly, right? He's trying to preempt Ammon's discussion about Christos, or Christos, however it may be pronounced, because he does not want to allow that if Christos means to anoint with the substance in 560 instances, that doesn't validate Ammon's concern about the use of this word. Why? Because occasionally it is used with other senses. Right? This is rhetorical nonsense. Any kind of reasonable referee would have cut him off right there and just said, nah, The rhetorical move here is a change of venue. You're presuming that Ammon's making a mistake, even though it's very clear that has not been proven or clarified. Right? So he's trying to preempt what he knows is coming, which is Ammon's evidence and experience for this particular sense of this term in many ancient Greek texts. Again and again and again it is seen. And there's a point where Ammon asks Luke if he's read Philuminus, I believe that's the name. And Luke, like a little child, says, no. Why? Why should I? What's the reason? Why do I have to have read Philuminus? Right? Instead of asking a crucial question here, something like, what is the import that you wish to attach to your readings of Philuminus, which I have not read? Yeah? I am not aware of it. And Luke knows precisely what Ammon's interest is. Right? Ammon is saying very clearly, if you were as schooled in these texts, these primary sources, as I am, then the meanings, the common meanings in the texts I am concerned with of this word Christos would be undeniably apparent to you. But since you have not read these things, and you're playing the role of, elected naysayer, right? You have your objections, right? Have no basis. Yeah? This is my perspective on Ammon's position, which is not articulated. Ammon was incredibly well behaved, in my view, in this recording, considering the childish, infantile, rhetorically dishonest, epistemologically dishonest behavior of the supposed classicist who clearly has no intention of listening to Ammon or even trying to understand what Ammon has seen and has become aware of through his deep exposure to these texts, and if I may be so bold, not merely to the texts, but to the spirits of the ancient Greek peoples and the beings that they were associated with, which is very clear Ammon has become personally familiar with. And by the way, in any academic discipline, that's not allowed. Right? That's forbidden. You can look at texts if you want, you can interpret texts, which what you are not to do is to establish direct contact through ritual, ceremony, passion, curiosity, or any other, motive that would illuminate the text with direct first-hand experience or contact with the intelligences that were present and active when these texts were composed in and as the people who composed them. Right? This is totally off the table. It's the one, cardinal sin. Since it is said to be impossible, by who? By the people who never tried it? Okay, great. You guys would know. No one wants to entertain this not merely possibility, the obvious fact of what Ammon has been up to, where part of where his perspectives arise, right? In my view, take responsibility for that personally. And part of why Ammon is so concerned that the academy is swarming with lying authorities who are trying to tell us what may or may not be the case, what they think the probability, the probabilistic interpretation of some word is, 0 people in history used a word according to their view of its probabilistic interpretation. Every single person who ever used a word, right, used a word as a vehicle to communicate a sense, an image, a picture, a memory, a feeling, all of these things. Right? The foundations of Luke's objections in this conversation are absolutely ridiculous. And any rhetorically trained referee would have disallowed, I believe, 90% of Luke's objections. And also given Ammon a bit more time to speak and explain how his views of these matters arose, what they are the results of in his work, research, passion, non-ordinary experience, right, which nearly no classicist has. I remember in my conversation with Ammon, I did get to ask him a few questions that I had on my list. I was hoping for a second conversation, so I was thinking this was just kind of get to know each other a bit. But I asked him very directly, did Scarborough, his mentor, his primary mentor and classicist in classical philology, and a translator of the PGM, did he experiment with any of the magical rites in the PGM? And Ammon was very quick to say no, he did not. I would never say that. That would be a slight on his family. No, he did not do that. But I didn't get to ask Ammon the second question, which I know the answer to. Did you? And Ammon definitely did. And there's no chance that those experiences have no bearing on Ammon's perspectives about matters specifically relating to the ancient Greek descriptions in primary sources that orbit polypharmacy, medicine, magic, sexuality, ritual, the mysteries, all of these things. And Ammon trying to talk to a guy like Luke reminds me of something so ridiculous that it's hard to make a metaphor of it. If Luke is posing as the arbiter of truthfulness or method, and he's examining Ammon's statements, Ammon would say, "I don't make arguments." Right? I know he says this. This is like an anvil examining a fish. Right? The one thing that Luke consistently does, which is disingenuous, is he will only treat with the skeleton, and he will only treat with it clinically and probabilistically. And from this perspective, it is impossible to validate anything at all, including Luke's own assertions. Right? And he knows this. This was an incredibly poorly mediated discussion. And Danny is responsible for this. Danny set up a situation where he hoped to sort of catch Ammon out by presenting him opposite someone trained in associated disciplines, but with none of Ammon's experience, fascination, interest, passion about very specific matters. Right? And one of the primary things that concerns Ammon, I know this, I've heard him say it many times, is that he despises lying. And he doesn't just mean saying something that isn't true. He means a weird kind of lying where, for example, we are told or someone is told, Ammon was told, right, that you must remove these chapters from your dissertation on recreational drug use. Why? Because the Romans would not have engaged in that kind of behavior. The Romans wouldn't have done this. This kind of lying, right? Telling us aforehand, which is exactly the kind of lying Luke is engaged in, what cannot be the case, without properly examining the case, with no intention to examine the case, with an intention to arbitrate from a position of abstract disinterest and refutation of the perspectives of others who have done the work on the ground, thousands of pages of reading, careful textual interpretation, linkages to support interpretations among multiple texts. No one cares about that. What they're going to do is tell Ammon what cannot be the case. Ammon is undergoing the same kind of inquisition in this that he underwent when attempting to publish his dissertation, his thesis, and get his PhD. It's a repeat of history. Oh, God. Once more into the breach. Ammon. Jesus. What the hell is going on here? Oh, it's the opposite of gorgeous. It's not beautiful. Yeah. People, do you see what's happening here? Hey, Ammon's being crucified on the skeleton of what people will not listen to one more time. Yeah, people who come to a situation deciding what cannot be the case before examining the evidence are lying. Straight up. And every time that Luke makes it clear that he has not read the material that has focused Ammon's attention, concern, awareness, insight, and discovery, then Luke is lying, right? He's saying, doesn't matter what's in those texts. We know X and Y from an overview of the entire academic community. Bullshit. There is no such supportable position anywhere, right? This is the vox populi fallacy. Well, 99.999% of people except Ammon believe blah, blah, blah. Really? Has he done that survey? I don't think he's done any kind of survey. He is making a vox populi rhetorical fallacy and presenting it as if it's evidentiary. Anyone with day one of rhetorical training knows, A, this is a childish move. B, it's the move of an insecure person. C, it is the move of an uninformed person. And D, it is an attempt at ontological authoritarianism. We know what can't be true because of all the people who don't agree that it's possible. Really? Okay. So in that case, humans don't fly in airplanes because every single human being on the face of the planet prior to the Wright brothers did not believe that there could be such a thing as an airplane. You know, minor 2 or 3 exceptions noted, Da Vinci, for example. So this is just fallacy after fallacy masquerading as academic authority. It is lying. Danny should be ashamed. I am embarrassed for Luke. He did not act with intellectual honesty or responsibility, with inquisitive honesty or responsibility, and with rhetorical skill. The moves he made are moves a third grader would make in their first attempt at a debate. They were childish, right? And Danny supported it every time. Right? Apparently, Danny's goal was to lynch Ammon with an academic authority. Absolute failure to accomplish that, but the appearance of it, it might seem that way to rhetorically untrained listeners. To people who've never been in an academic debate and don't understand what that looks like. And Ammon, as far as I can tell, Ammon was all in good faith, right? Was willing to have the conversation with someone who could be understood as a colleague in the academic sense of having similar, right, interests and study and so forth. But the similarity is modest because Ammon's got a specific continuum of interests that are not shared by Luke and that Luke has no experience of. So to elect him to defame or refute or debate Ammon is ridiculous, senseless, wrong-minded, confused, and in no way produces an authoritative evaluation of Ammon's passion, findings, understanding, scholarship, and thousands of hours of reading ancient Greek text with an eye to understanding central principles here over and over again. Now, I am not a Greek philologist, and I'm not a classicist. I don't read Greek. I know a bit about Hebrew. I know a lot about the nature of alphabets. And most of that comes from non-ordinary experience, not just reading books. But I recognize in Ammon the fingerprint of someone who has been entirely outside what ordinary humans have ever seen, known, or believed. Right? And the idea that some, academic scholar could perform an inquisition on him and determine what is true and what is not is ridiculous. Once again, it's like, an automobile trying to determine whether a bird drives cars. Right? Just a completely senseless comparison here. So a lot of kudos to Ammon for his patience and his willingness to participate in such a charade, and his good behavior during the charade. There's so much here that I'll probably make another recording on this topic, because what a mess, right? What a mess. And I don't know Ammon personally. I suspect he's a rather difficult person to be close with, partly because he's not merely human anymore. Right? He's been outside of the cave. He has relationships with the beings, the dead girl among them, Medea among them, outside the caves. And ordinary people have none of this. And there is no form of academic study, none, that could possibly empower you to arbitrate over the discoveries, knowledge, insight, and wisdom that Ammon has acquired in a very personal and intimate way that does not resemble academic scholarship or probabilistic evaluations of the meanings of terms or rituals or rites. Yeah? These are not the same thing at all. Right? In terms of, Ammon does have a few core ideas, some of which are at least modestly questionable, if not fairly questionable. The interpretation of a specific text, I think it's in Mark, where Jesus is in Gethsemane, I think, and there's a neoniskos involved, right? Ammon's specific interpretation of this, I don't yet fully understand. Right? And it seems a bit egregious. And some of Ammon's other positions seem a bit egregious to me. But I don't have the experience he has. Right? Imagine if somebody came to me and they wanted to arbitrate academically over, who knows what, like my experience with the NHI complex. Good luck. You have none of the primary aspects of concern, awareness, or orientation that could possibly allow you to arbitrate that, unless you've had wild, unless you're somebody like Robert Monroe, who speaks very directly in a commonplace way about contact with non-embodied intelligences through the gateway process and other experiments that he did over at least 50 years. Right? So if you get somebody with no experience of that, and they want to arbitrate over my experience, they are missing the organs of a knowledge, articulation, understanding, and awareness that would empower them to do that. Yeah? It's just all missing. It's also reminds me of two people kissing and some third clinician attempting to dissect the kiss and determine what was the case during this kiss. We're talking about intimate, interior experience, awareness, knowledge, understanding, and insight. These are not the the values of the academy. Okay? So, I mean, kudos to Ammon for going through that ringer. Wish I'd been there. They should have had an independent rhetorical arbiter there, not Danny. Danny's abilities here are not entirely missing, but very primitive. He is not rhetorically trained. And so he will not recognize, he's so concerned that Ammon might be coloring outside of the lines that he is completely blind to where Luke does almost every time he opens his mouth. And nearly every time Luke opens his mouth, he's changing the venue. Yeah, this is another rhetorical move. We're not going to talk about what you're talking about. We're going to talk about method. Right. That's a change of venue. Right. And that immediately cuts off Ammon's ability to express his understandings and their origins, and how he came to them. Because what Luke is going to say is, there's only one way to do that. I know that way. You don't. You're not doing it right. End of discussion. Change of venue. One more time. So, yeah. This is a travesty. Yeah, really a travesty. Ammon's views may or may not be more or less accurate or correct. They're extremely inspiring. And I think they give us a glimpse of ancient Greek life, thought, concern, behavior, ritual, polypharmacy, that no one has given us. And what I think a lot of people don't realize, especially people like Danny, is Ammon can be wrong, right? It cannot be true what he is saying, and it can still be more productive of insight than any true thing that has ever been said. This is the nature of insight. This is why we have art, poetry, music, dance, right? The entire field of science fiction and all of religious literature orients around this pivot. Insight, not the facts. And when you attempt to treat insight in such a way that you will only deal with the skeletal remains and you ignore the flesh of it, you ignore the living aspect, you're committing a sin, bruh. Yeah, you're sinning. Missing the mark. Oh my God. Yeah, you're on the wrong road, brother. You gotta get right with yourself. Yeah, you do. You got to. Right? So, these are some of my perspectives for the moment. As far as I'm concerned, on a 10-point scorecard, Ammon gets an 8, Luke gets a 2, Danny gets a 2. Right. Ammon's done the work and is giving us revelations about the Greek language itself, how powerful it is, how mystical it is, how musical it is, how poetic, how metaphoric, how trans-metaphoric it is, and still is today. This is the same thing you will discover if you look into the work of the Greek mystagogue Maria Maragou, who I have a couple of interviews with on my channel, and who is brilliant and leads people in the mysteries today in Greece. Right? She will tell you very similar things. The Greek alphabet is pure magic. Yeah? It is transcendental. She's right about that, in my view. Will the academics admit that? Probably zero chance of this. They don't care, right? What they want is the skeletal remains. They want just the facts, ma'am. Well, 90% of our experience of being human is not the facts. They have a trenchant effect on specific aspects of our experience. Outside of that scope, they're not only useless, they're blinding. So if you want insight, you're not after the facts. You don't want to just make shit up, quote unquote. But what you will discover if you look carefully into what, quote, the facts are about these matters, most of them have been made up, and this is Ammon's assertion. Right? So these are some of my thoughts and reflections for now. I hope you've enjoyed this recording. Try to post it soon. I wrote Ammon about this a couple days ago, or last night actually, and haven't got a response from him yet. We'll see what comes of it. But as far as I'm concerned, Ammon's reputation remains unsullied by this bizarre inquisition, and if anything is enhanced. Danny got it wrong. Shouldn't have set up a hanging court for Ammon in public. Dumb idea. Yeah. Especially with the wrong kinds of central features of authority and concern. I wish you beauty, bliss, liberation, amazing adventures, insight, wonderful dreams, love, playful exploration, and the fulfillment of the promise of your human incarnation this time around. Thank you for joining me. Take a moment to like or share, comment or ask a question, criticize, support the channel in whatever way feels natural to you. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.